There is a painting in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, a minor work catalogued under Unknown Dutch Master circa 1672, that no curator has ever fully explained. It shows a dinner scene. 8 figures around a long oak table. Handles. A boar's head on a silver platter. The figures are dressed in the fashion of wealthy merchants. Velvet doublets, lace collars, rings catching painted light. The brushwork is extraordinary. Whoever made it was a genius, or close enough that the difference no longer matters. But here is what the catalogues do not mention. Here is what only the night shift security guards whisper to each other over lukewarm coffee at 3 a.m. In 1997, a restoration expert named Lena Bruggeman took a series of high-resolution photographs of the painting before beginning a routine cleaning of its varnish. She photographed it on a Monday. She returned on Thursday to begin her work. The photographs, the Monday photographs, showed 8 figures at the table. But when she stood before the actual painting on Thursday morning, she counted only 7. She assumed she had miscounted. She went back to the photographs. She went back to the painting. 7. She called her assistant. Together they counted again. 7. She pulled out the photographs and laid them on the floor of the conservation studio. Nobody could explain it. The official record states that Bruggeman experienced fatigue-induced perceptual distortion. She submitted to this explanation publicly. She told her colleagues she agreed. She quit 3 months later. She never set foot in a museum again. She moved to a small house in the Zeeland province, near the coast, where there are long, flat horizons and nothing to hang on the walls except a calendar she replaces every January. Her windows face east. She likes to see the sun rise. She likes knowing exactly where it is at all times. She never explained why. But if you knew what I know, if you had spent the last 2 years chasing the history of the Astrid clan through dusty auction records and faded estate inventories and one extraordinary leather-bound journal written in a dialect of German so old it barely resembles modern language, you would understand Lena Bruggeman completely. You would understand the east-facing windows. You would understand the empty walls. And you would probably understand why. When Marcus Aldridge inherited a painting from his great-uncle's estate on a cold October Tuesday, the first thing I wanted to do was call him and tell him to burn it. I didn't, of course. I was too late. Marcus Aldridge was 34 years old, worked as a freelance graphic designer in Edinburgh, and had never particularly cared about art. He cared about clean lines, negative space, the geometry of logos. He cared about kerning. He cared about the kind of precision that could be measured in pixels and points. Paintings, large, imprecise, smelling of turpentine and old wood, were not his world. His great-uncle Edmund, however, had lived his entire life inside that world. Edmund Aldridge had been a collector. Not a famous one, not the kind whose name appears in auction catalogs or Sunday supplement profiles. He was what the trade calls a quiet collector. Someone who accumulates slowly, carefully, without display, driven by criteria no one else fully understands. He had spent 60 years acquiring paintings, and when he died at 87 in a cluttered house in the Borders, he left behind what the estate solicitor described in a letter as a considerable collection of artworks, primarily portraits and domestic scenes, of varying provenance and condition. Everything was divided between 3 heirs. Marcus's Aunt Judith received 12 paintings of moderate value. His cousin Derek received 7 and a bronze statuette. Marcus, as the youngest and the one Edmund had apparently mentioned most fondly in his final years, received the remaining 11 paintings, and one painting specifically called out by name in the handwritten codicil Edmund had added to his will just 8 weeks before his death. The codicil read, in Edmund's cramped, increasingly shaky handwriting, asterisk to Marcus specifically, the Astrid Gathering, oil on panel, approximate date 1680s, which I acquired in 1991 from the estate of Heinrich Braun of Freiburg. I leave this piece to Marcus not because it is the most valuable, it is not, but because I believe he will look at it closely. He has always been a person who notices things. Someone should notice this painting. It has been waiting a long time to be properly seen. Asterisk. Marcus had driven down to collect the paintings on a Saturday, rented a van, and spent 4 hours wrapping canvases in bubble wrap with a friend named Callum who kept making jokes about the smell. He hadn't unwrapped them for a week. When he finally did, alone on a Sunday afternoon, while rain smeared the Edinburgh skyline grey, he worked through them systematically, leaning each one against the living room wall, making notes on his phone about condition and subject. 8 landscapes, 2 still lives with fruit and dead birds. And then the last one, the Astrid Gathering. It was large, roughly 90 centimeters wide, 60 tall, painted on a dark wood panel that was heavier than he expected. The frame was elaborate, carved oak, dark with age, adorned with a repeating motif he couldn't quite identify. Vines maybe, or fingers, something organic and slightly unnerving. The painting itself showed a great hall. Stone walls, high, narrow windows through which no light entered. A fire burning in a massive hearth at the far end. And gathered around it, standing, sitting, leaning against the walls, were figures. He counted them immediately because the composition demanded it. They were arranged in a way that drew the eye to each face in sequence, like a choreographed stage direction. 12 figures. Men, women, a few who seemed ageless in the way painted people sometimes do. All of them dressed in dark clothing, reds and blacks and deep greens. All of them facing inward toward the fire, except for one. One figure, at the far left of the composition, was turned slightly away from the hearth, turned, Marcus realized, toward the viewer. Her face was pale, extraordinarily pale, even accounting for the conventions of 17th century portraiture. Her eyes were dark. Her expression was not quite a smile. He found himself staring at her for a long time. He finally shook himself, made a note. 12 figures, unusual composition, possible Northern European, one figure facing outward, and moved on. He hung the painting in his study above his desk because the dimensions fit the wall perfectly and because, if he was being honest with himself, which he occasionally managed to be, he liked looking at it. He liked the pale woman at the left. He liked that she was facing him. He did not yet understand what that meant. Before I tell you what happened to Marcus, I need to tell you about the journal. I found it in a private archive in Freiburg, the same city where Heinrich Braun had lived, the man from whose estate Edmund Aldrich had purchased the painting in 1991. Braun's granddaughter, a woman named Ingrid, had held onto a box of papers she'd never bothered to examine, because the papers were in Old German and she didn't read Old German and she'd had, she told me, considerably more interesting things to worry about for the past 30 years. The journal was written by a woman who identified herself on the first page as Katharina Astrid, dated her first entry to the year 1683, and wrote in a voice that swung without warning between the coldly clinical and the ecstatically strange. Took me 4 months to fully translate. What follows is what I believe to be the essential history. The Astrid family had been, in the early 17th century, a prosperous merchant family in the Rhineland. Wealthy, well-connected, and, if Katharina's account can be trusted, afflicted with what she calls throughout the journal simply das Geschenk, the gift. What she means by the gift becomes clear early in the text. The Astrid family did not age normally. They did not die of illness. They healed from wounds that would have killed ordinary people. They were, in the language available to them in 1683, blessed by God, or cursed by something older than God, depending on who in the family you asked and on what night you asked them. They also, and here Katharina's clinical detachment becomes almost impressive, needed blood to sustain themselves. Not in the dramatic quantities of later folklore. Not nightly, but regularly and unavoidably, and with increasing difficulty as the decades wore on and the hunters grew more organized. Because by the 1680s, the hunters were very organized indeed. Katharina does not name the organization hunting her family. She refers to them throughout only as Die Gräfer, the graspers. From context and cross-referencing with other historical records I've since located, I believe they were affiliated with a network of ecclesiastical enforcers operating out of Cologne, tasked specifically with what their internal documents called the suppression of the unliving. They were, by any standard, very good at their work. In 10 years, they had reduced the Astrid clan from 37 members to 14. They had burned 3 family properties. They had developed, through a combination of genuine scholarship and brutal trial and error, a set of reliable methods for locating, trapping, and destroying the kind of being the Astrid family was. The family held a council in the winter of 1683. Katerina was the one who recorded it. They had, by that point, tried everything available to them. They had scattered across Europe. They had changed their names. They had bribed officials, forged documents, paid handsomely for protection they could not entirely trust. None of it was enough. Die Grafer were patient and systematic in the way that only truly motivated bureaucrats can be. The solution came from the youngest member of the clan at that time, a boy of apparent age 11, actual age somewhere north of 60, named Pieter. Pieter was a painter, not metaphorically, not as a hobby. Pieter Astrid was, by the assessment of everyone who saw his work, a genuine genius. He had been painting since childhood, had studied under 3 masters before the age of 30, and had developed a technical and theoretical understanding of paint and surface and light that put him far ahead of most of his contemporaries. He had also, over the previous decade, been conducting experiments that nobody else in the family fully understood. Katerina records his explanation of these experiments with a mixture of awe and skepticism that she eventually abandons in favor of pure awe. Pieter had discovered, through methods the journal describes only as deep and exhausting study of the relationship between the painted world and the world that paints it, that the interior of a sufficiently well-made painting was not nothing. It was not a flat surface of pigment. It was not an illusion. It was, under certain conditions, using certain materials, with certain intentions embedded in every brushstroke, a space. A real space, with dimensions that did not correspond to the dimensions of the physical panel or canvas, but that were nonetheless real in every measurable sense. You could enter them. You could inhabit them. You could, if the painting was built correctly, live inside them. The catch, and there was always a catch, Katerina notes with dry resignation, was that this interior space was not accessible from the outside. A human standing before the painting saw only what paintings always showed, a fixed arrangement of color and form. The figures inside could not speak to them, could not signal them, could not be heard. The interior beings, however, could see out, and they could leave, under specific conditions, conditions that Pieter had spent a decade refining. A figure inside the painting could exit the frame, step through the surface, enter the world, but only at night. Only when the sun was fully below the horizon, and only if no human eye was watching the painting at the exact moment of passage. This last condition was, Pieter admitted, the most unpredictable. He could not explain why human observation collapsed the possibility of passage. He only knew that it did. It was the one reliable finding of all his experiments. If someone was looking directly at the painting when a figure attempted to exit, the figure simply could not. The surface held. The world outside remained inaccessible, which meant they needed to be careful, which meant, the clan agreed around that council fire in the winter of 1683, that they needed to be very, very careful. But it also meant they would be safe. No hunter could follow them into a painting. No sun could reach them inside. Pieter spent 6 months building the painting that would become their home. Katerina records the process in extraordinary detail, a mixture of supply lists, philosophical notes, and what can only be described as prayers, though to what she never specifies. He used a wooden panel of seasoned oak, cut from a tree that had been growing since before any living member of the clan had been born. He prepared the surface with 17 layers of gesso, each one allowed to cure completely before the next was applied. He ground his own pigments from materials he had sourced across Europe, lapis lazuli from a trader in Amsterdam, vermilion from a source in Venice, a black he made himself from burned vine wood and that he told no one else how to prepare. He worked only at night by candlelight alone. The painting he created, the painting that would eventually be called the Astrid Gathering, though it had no name for many years, depicted a great hall. Specifically, the great hall of the family's ancestral house in the Rhineland, which had been burned by Die Grafer in 1679. He painted it from memory, with an accuracy that Katerina, who had lived in that house for 40 years, found unsettling. Every stone was right. Every shadow fell correctly. He painted the fireplace last. He told Katerina, when she asked why, that the fire was the most important element. It was the warmth of the interior world, the thing that would make it inhabitable and not merely accessible. He needed to paint it not as fire appeared, but as fire felt. The distinction, he said, was everything. When it was done, he called the family together and showed them what he had made. And then, one by one, they went inside. The process of entry is described by Katerina with a precision that makes it more, not less, mysterious. You stood before the painting. You placed your hand flat against the surface. Not gripping, not pressing, simply resting, the way you would rest a hand on a sleeping child's back. You closed your eyes. You thought of the room you had painted, the fire, the stone, the specific quality of the imagined warmth. And you stepped forward. The surface gave. The world shifted. And you were inside. She describes it as the most terrifying thing she had ever done. And she had lived through 3 house fires, a siege, and the death of everyone she had loved in the previous century. Not because it hurt. It didn't hurt. But because for one instant, the instant of passage, she was neither inside nor outside, neither in the painting nor in the world. And in that instant she experienced what she could only describe as the full weight of her own unnaturalness. The understanding that she was not supposed to exist. That she persisted in the world through a kind of constant, effortful insistence on being. And that this insistence could, in a moment, simply stop. Then she was through, and the fire was warm, and Pieter was there, smiling his strange, ageless smile. And all 14 of them were in the painted hall together for the first time. The world inside the painting was larger than the painting. Much larger. The dimensions of the depicted room matched the dimensions of any real room of comparable scale. They could walk in it, sit in it. The fire gave warmth. There was no food or drink, but they had, by that point in their long lives, become accustomed to hunger as a condition rather than an emergency. There was only one door, and it was the frame. Pieter had built 2 rules into the painting's construction. Rules, he said, could not be broken without destroying the mechanism entirely. Rule 1. No member of the clan could remain outside the painting when the sun rose. The painting's interior was, for reasons he could articulate technically but not philosophically, immune to the sun. The exterior was not. If you were caught outside the frame at sunrise, you would not be protected. Rule 2. You could not exit the painting if a human was watching it. Not looking near it. Not in the same room. Watching it. The moment a human gaze fixed directly on the painting's surface with genuine attention, the kind of attention that sees rather than merely looks, the passage closed. They accepted both rules. They had, after all, very little choice. Here is what I find most extraordinary about the history of the Astrid clan, and what I think about most on the nights when sleep won't come. For 340 years they have lived inside that painting. They have moved with it, obviously. A single artwork, however well made, does not sit on the same wall for 3 centuries. It passes through hands, through estates, through auction rooms and private collections and the occasional dusty attic. The Astrid gathering has been catalogued in records I have traced through Germany, France, the Netherlands, England, and finally Scotland, where Edmund Aldridge purchased it and kept it for 30 years. 30 years. I think about Edmund Aldridge often. I think about the codicil he added to his will. Asterisk, someone should notice this painting. It has been waiting a long time to be properly seen. Asterisk. He knew. He must have known. Not everything. I don't think he knew the history, the full scope of what lived inside that frame. But he knew something was there. He had kept it for 30 years, and he had put it on a specific wall in a specific room of his house, and he had, I'm almost certain of this though I cannot prove it, stayed out of that room at night. He had given them space. And at the end, he had passed the painting to the one person in his family who, as he put it, notices things. Marcus Aldridge. He noticed on a Thursday. He had been working late. A logo project for a distillery in Speyside that was taking twice as long as it should. And at some point past midnight he pushed back from his desk, stretched, and looked up at the painting. He had a habit of looking at it while he worked. He'd become aware of this habit gradually. The way you become aware of a new sound in your neighborhood. One day you realize you've been hearing it for weeks. The pale woman at the left edge of the composition had become, without his quite deciding this, a kind of companion. He found her face calming. The way she looked out of the painting, direct without aggression or demand, made him feel irrationally that he was being checked on, monitored in a benign way, like having a thoughtful colleague in the room. On this Thursday night, past midnight, he looked up at the painting and counted the figures. He had counted them before, of course. He had noted 12 in his phone on the afternoon he'd first unwrapped it. But he counted now from habit, from the graphic designer's compulsion to quantify composition. He counted 11. He counted again. 11. He stood up, walked to the painting and studied it closely. 11 figures, gathered around the fire, including the pale woman at the left, who was still there, still facing outward, still wearing her expression that was almost but not quite a smile. He thought, I must have miscounted before. He was tired. He had been staring at a screen for 6 hours. He went to bed. In the morning he counted again. 12. He stood there in the grey Edinburgh morning, counting the same painting he had counted twice the night before, and it had a different number of figures in it. He was not, by nature, a person who jumped to dramatic conclusions. He was a person who kerned fonts and measured negative space and believed that most problems had solutions that were boring, obvious, and simply required sufficient attention to locate. So he did what any reasonable person does when confronted with an impossible observation. He decided he had made an error and looked for it. He photographed the painting. He examined the photograph on his screen, zooming in, counting carefully. 12. He went to work. He came back. He looked at the painting. 12. He did this every day for a week. 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. On the 8th day, a Saturday, he was home all day. He hadn't left the apartment. He went to make coffee at 3 in the afternoon and came back to find 11. He stopped in the doorway. He stood very still, the way you stand when you've just seen something in your peripheral vision that doesn't belong. He looked at the painting. He counted 11 figures. The pale woman still present. The position of several figures slightly different from what he remembered. One man who had been standing near the fire now appeared to be sitting. A woman in a green dress who had been at the center of the group was now slightly to the right. His hands were, he realized, not entirely steady. He walked to his desk, opened his laptop, pulled up the photographs he had taken 10 days earlier. He put his phone next to the laptop, opened the photo app, and photographed the painting again right now, this moment. He put the two images side by side. 12 figures in the first image. 11 in the second. Different positions. He sat for a long time with this information. Then, because he was who he was, a person who noticed things, he started keeping records. He began photographing the painting 3 times a day. Morning, midday, and before bed. He kept a spreadsheet, because of course he did, because he was a graphic designer with an orderly mind and a taste for documentation, tracking figure count, positions, any identifiable changes in expression or gesture. Within 2 weeks, certain patterns had emerged. The figure count was always 12 in the morning photographs. It was always 12 in the midday photographs. It fluctuated in the evening photographs. Sometimes 12, sometimes fewer. It was almost never 12 in the photographs taken between midnight and 3 a.m. On the rare occasions he stayed up that late. The pale woman was always present. The positions of the other figures changed. Not randomly, he began to recognize patterns in the changes. A tall man in a black doublet who had been standing to the right of the fire gradually, over a series of days, moved to stand nearer the left wall. A woman with gray-streaked hair appeared to have aged between one photograph and the next, an observation Marcus stared at for 20 minutes before deciding he was almost certainly wrong. He was not wrong. He also noticed, and this took him longer because it was subtler than the figure count, that the quality of light within the painting changed. Not the painted light. The actual light within the depicted scene. The fire in the hearth burned brighter in some photographs than others. The shadows fell at different angles. These changes were not consistent with different ambient lighting in his study. He controlled for this, photographing with a consistent setup, a controlled light source. The changes were happening inside the painting. He did not sleep well. He began researching. He found nothing about the Astrid gathering by name in any accessible database. He found a catalog entry from a 1993 German art fair that listed a painting by that name in a private collection. No image, no further details. He found a reference in a 1940s German academic paper on 17th-century domestic painting that mentioned a remarkable composition depicting an interior gathering scene, notable for the unusual number of figures and the apparent presence of a figure breaking the picture plane, which he took to mean the pale woman looking out. He began trying to find Edmund's papers. His Aunt Judith had most of them. Edmund had been organized, meticulous, the kind of man who kept everything in labeled folders. She sent Marcus 3 boxes, slightly reluctantly, via courier. In the third box, in a folder labeled in Edmund's handwriting simply Astrid, Marcus found the following: a receipt from a 1991 auction in Freiburg, a photograph of the painting as it had appeared in Edmund's living room in 1994. Marcus recognized it immediately, recognized the pale woman, counted the figures in the photograph. 12. A series of handwritten notes in Edmund's cramped script, evidently from various years. Some notes were on yellowed paper, others on modern lined sheets. And a single page, torn from a notebook, on which Edmund had written in large, careful letters. Asterisk, they are real. Have seen them move. They come out at night. I do not know what they want, but they have never harmed me, and I believe they are merely surviving, as we all are, in whatever way is available to them. I have decided to leave them in peace. I ask only that whoever comes after me extends them the same courtesy. Asterisk. Asterisk, if they frighten you, leave the study light on. They will not exit if they know you are watching. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you are curious, sit in the dark. Be patient. Be very quiet. Asterisk. Asterisk, I was never brave enough to try the second option myself. Perhaps you will be. Asterisk. He thought about it for 2 weeks. He thought about it the way he thought about design problems that intimidated him. Circling them, examining them from different angles, building elaborate internal arguments for and against engagement, and then eventually doing the thing anyway because the not doing was worse. On a November night, a Tuesday, with rain against the windows and the city damp and quiet at 1:30 a.m., Marcus Aldridge turned off every light in his study, settled into his desk chair facing the painting, and waited. He had a recorder running on his phone in his pocket, audio only. He'd decided not to use video. He wasn't entirely sure why. Seemed somehow like too aggressive a form of watching. He'd also sent a text to Callum that said, "Staying up late tonight, might message you later, nothing important, just an experiment." He hadn't explained further. Callum had sent back a thumbs up and gone to sleep. The room was dark. The painting was a shadow against a shadow. He couldn't see anything. He waited. At 2:17 a.m., the recording on his phone captured what sounds like a faint sound. A sound Marcus described to me later, when I eventually found him, which I'll come to, as like pressing your thumb against a drumhead. A resonance in something under tension. At 2:21 a.m., the recording captures a second sound. This one is slightly different. Lower. Sustained for perhaps a second and a half. And then, at 2:22 a.m., in Marcus Aldridge's darkened study in Edinburgh, with rain on the windows and the city asleep, something stepped out of the painting and into the room. He could hear it. He could not see it, the room was too dark for that. But he could hear the sound of weight settling onto the floorboards, the creak of old wood that knew the difference between empty air and something standing in it. He could hear, and this detail, when he told me, raised every hair on my body, the particular quality of occupied silence. The air pressure difference of a room that contained something breathing, even though the thing in his room was not technically breathing. He did not move. He did not speak. He sat in the dark with his hands flat on his thighs and waited to see what would happen. For a long time. He estimates 7 minutes, the recording suggests closer to 4. Nothing happened. The presence in the room remained still. Marcus remained still. The rain continued. Then a voice said in accented English very quietly, "We know you can hear us." He said nothing. Your great-uncle used to hum, the voice said. When we came out, he would sit in the dark and hum very softly, so we knew he was there. We found it comforting. Marcus, who is not a man who hums, said, I don't hum. We noticed, the voice said. And despite everything, despite the darkness and the impossibility and the tight, careful terror that had been building in him for 4 minutes, he recognized the tone. It was dry. It was almost amused. It was the voice, he thought, of someone who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation and found, now that it was happening, that they were slightly relieved. He said, Are you the one who's always looking out? Oz. Yes, the voice said. What's your name? Katerina. He breathed. How many of you are there? He asked. Now. 9, Katerina Astrid said. We were 14 when we went in. Time passes differently inside the painting than outside, but it still passes. We are not immortal. We simply die more slowly. And more quietly. Another pause. Pieter died in 1801. He was very old, even by our standards. He was content. He said he had built something that would last, and he was right. That was enough for him. What happened to the others? The ones who died. They simply stopped being inside. One morning we woke and there was one fewer. We believe they go on somewhere. We believe this very strongly, because the alternative is difficult to inhabit. Marcus thought about this. Are you going to hurt me? He asked. Not with panic. With the directness of a person who has decided that the question needs to be on the table. No, Katerina said. We haven't hurt a keeper in 150 years. We found it created complications. We prefer the arrangement your great-uncle offered us. Discretion, coexistence, mutual awareness without interference. What do you need from me? The question surprised her. He could tell because she was silent for longer than she had been for any previous answer. Need, she said finally. You come out at night. You go somewhere. You do something. I assume it's not just standing in my study. No, she said. We feed. When necessary. Carefully. In ways that don't attract attention. He thought about this carefully. Edinburgh is a big city, he said. Yes, she said. Your great-uncle lived in a rural area. It was sometimes difficult. Edinburgh is considerably more convenient. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, Marcus said. That is probably wise, Katerina agreed. He asked her about the history. She told him some of it, less than I know from the journal, but enough. The hunters, the council, Pieter's genius. 3 centuries of walls and rooms and careful, watchful passage through the dark edges of human civilization. 9 surviving members of a clan that had once filled a house with noise and argument, and the complicated life of a large, peculiar, ancient family, now occupying a space 90 centimeters wide and 60 tall, and living their long, strange, increasingly quiet lives inside a rectangle of oil and pigment on seasoned oak. He asked her if they were happy. She was quiet for a long time. We are together, she said finally. After everything, we are still together. That is not nothing. He said, No, I don't suppose it is. At 3:15 a.m., he heard the sound again, the pressing thumb resonance, the sustained low note, and she was gone. He turned on the light. He looked at the painting. The pale woman at the left edge of the composition was looking out at him. Her expression, that thing that was almost but not quite a smile. He counted the figures. 12. He kept his word. This is the thing about Marcus Aldridge that I most want you to understand, because it is the thing that matters most and the thing that is easiest to overlook in favor of the more dramatic elements of this story. He kept his word. He had not precisely given his word. The conversation in the dark had not ended with explicit promises or formal agreements. But he understood what had been established, and he honored it. He stopped photographing the painting 3 times a day. He kept one photograph as a reference, framed and saved on a cloud drive, something steady to return to when his own memory started doing unreliable things, but he did not maintain the spreadsheet. He did not try to document the exits and entrances. He did not put up cameras. He left the study light on when he was sleeping or away. He left it off when he was awake and willing to have company. Twice more in that first winter. He sat in the dark and Katerina came out. The second conversation was brief. She had come to warn him about something he hadn't noticed. A crack developing in the lower right corner of the panel, hairline but present, which could over time compromise the structural integrity of Pieter's construction. She told him who to call and what to ask for. He took notes. He called a specialist in wooden panel paintings the next morning, and the man came out and did the repair work and charged him £400 and told him the painting was in remarkable condition for its age. The third conversation was longer. It began with Katerina asking him about his work. She had been watching him, obviously, from inside the painting for however long he'd had it, and was curious about the things she'd seen him create. He explained graphic design. She explained the economics of running a 17th-century merchant empire while being constitutionally unable to operate during daylight hours. They found this symmetrical in a way that made both of them, improbably, laugh. He asked her once whether they were bored. Whether 300 years inside a 90 by 60 panel of painted would produce the kind of existential despair that he should be concerned about. She thought about this for a while. "We have each other," she said. "We have the fire. Pieter built it to generate real warmth, real light, and it burns as though it has always just been lit. We have the memories of everything we lived before, which is more than most people have. And we have the windows." "The painting doesn't have windows," he said. "I've looked at it. It's a windowless hall." "There are no windows in the painting," she agreed. "But there are windows inside it. Pieter added them after the construction. He said a space without windows was a prison, and he refused to build a prison for his family. What do the windows look out on?" Long pause. "That," Katerina Astrid said, "is a question I cannot answer simply. The windows look out on whatever the painting is looking at. If the painting is on a wall facing east, the windows inside look east. If the painting is in a room with a view of the sea, we can see the sea from the windows. We watched the Rhineland for 30 years. We watched a farmhouse in France for 80. We have watched your Edinburgh for 30 years, and it is not the worst view we have had." He looked at the painting the next morning, at the pale woman looking out. He had always assumed she was looking at him. He understood now that she was looking at the room, at the world, at the extraordinary specific view of a life happening in real time in front of a rectangle of oak and oil. She was watching Edinburgh. She was watching him. He raised a hand, feeling slightly foolish. Her expression, he could have sworn, shifted. Not dramatically. The almost smile became something slightly more definite. He went to make coffee. He had a logo to finish. The world continued. I found Marcus 8 months after he inherited the painting. I had been chasing the journal, chasing the history, chasing the trail of a painting that kept appearing at the edges of records and then vanishing back into private hands. I had found Ingrid Braun and the archive in Freiburg. I had translated the journal. I had found the 1993 catalogue entry. I had found Lena Bruggemann, who would not speak to me. I had found the night shift security guard from the Rijksmuseum. Different painting, different clan, a story for another time. Who would? I found an academic paper Marcus had posted to an obscure online forum for art history researchers, framed entirely as a question. Had anyone else observed apparent figure count discrepancies in 17th century Dutch and Northern European domestic scenes? Was there literature? Was there a known technical explanation? 3 people had responded, none helpfully. I sent a private message. We met in Edinburgh, in a coffee shop off the Royal Mile, on a grey January morning. He was cautious at first. I would have been too. But I had the journal, and the journal contained descriptions of the interior of the painting that were specific enough that once I described the windows that weren't visible in the painting but existed inside it. He went very still and then very slowly nodded. We talked for 4 hours. He told me about the conversations in the dark. About Katerina's warning about the panel crack. About the almost smile. About Edmund's note. Asterisk, someone should notice this painting. It has been waiting a long time to be properly seen. Asterisk. I told him about Pieter's methods, about the council in the winter of 1683, about 14 people stepping through a painted surface into a space made of light and oil, and one old man's refusal to let his family be destroyed. At the end of it, he bought us both another coffee and said, "So what do we do with this?" I said I didn't know. I said I had found this story by following the painting, and I had followed the painting because I needed to understand it, and now that I understood it, I wasn't entirely sure what came next. He said, "She asked me once, Katerina, whether I thought they had made the right choice. Going inside. What did you say?" I said I didn't know. I said it seemed like it had kept them together and kept them alive, and that those were probably the criteria that mattered at the time. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. She said, "And I've thought about this a lot," she said. "Every cage is a shelter, seen from the right angle. We simply had to learn to find the right angle." I wrote that down. I'm telling you this story because Katerina Astrid asked me to. Not directly. Not in a darkened room. She doesn't know I exist. Marcus hasn't told her. But I've been living with her words, her journal, her strange clinical poetry, her account of stepping through a painted surface into a space that wasn't supposed to exist, for 2 years now, and I feel somehow that she has been waiting for this too. Waiting to be known. Not just seen from the outside, as a pale figure at the edge of a composition, looking out. Known. Pieter built windows that look out from the inside. He built a space where 9 surviving members of an impossible family can stand at painted windows and watch the world continue. What he couldn't build was a door that opened both ways. What he couldn't build was the ability to be seen from the outside looking in. For 340 years, they have watched without being watched. They have been in the room without being in the room. Until an old man in the Scottish borders noticed, and kept quiet, and passed the painting on. Until a graphic designer in Edinburgh noticed, and kept quiet, and sat in the dark. Until I found the journal. Until you heard this story. I want to leave you with 2 things. The first is a fact. The Astrid Gathering, oil on panel, approximately 90 by 60 centimeters, unknown Northern European master circa 1680s, is currently hanging in a study in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the possession of a man who turns off his study light some nights and sits quietly in the dark, and occasionally has conversations with a woman who has been alive since 1640 and who, he tells me, has very specific opinions about the state of contemporary architecture and finds the internet conceptually baffling but emotionally comprehensible. The painting is not for sale. The second thing is a question. And it's the question I've been living with since I first read Katerina's journal, since I first understood what Pieter had built and why, since I first grasped the full weight of what it means to make a shelter out of art and then live inside it for more than 3 centuries. If you had to choose, if the world became so dangerous that safety meant confinement, if survival meant stepping through a frame and leaving the sunlight behind, what would you put in your painting? What room would you build, in oil and pigment and one old genius's carefully hoarded understanding of the relationship between representation and reality? What fire would you paint, to make sure it was warm enough to last forever? What would you paint in the windows so you could always see the world? I've thought about this longer than I care to admit. I keep coming back to the same answer. I would paint the people I loved in it. I would make sure they were all in the room. I would paint them around a fire, in a great hall, caught in a moment of being together, gathered, present, warm, real. And I would put one figure at the edge of the composition, looking out. So that whatever happened to the world outside, whatever fire or hunters or slow centuries of change, there would always be one face in the frame that was turned toward the living. Watching. Waiting. Keeping the window open.